When we gather here, it is not to skim the surface, but to touch the raw edges of what it means to feel too much. You, who have carried the tremors of others inside your own skin, know that sensitivity is no accident. It is born in the wound, etched into the nervous system by betrayal, by abandonment, by the shocks that crack a childhood open before it is ready. Empathy, then, is not first a gift. It is a scar that listens. It is vigilance learned for survival. Yet in the paradox of psyche, the very scar becomes the gateway. What begins as a shield later opens into sight. The empath's path does not start in comfort. It begins in rupture. Like the animal that survives only by sharpening its senses, the young soul learns to read rooms, to anticipate moods, to decode every unspoken word before danger arrives. This is the inheritance of pain, sensitivity turned radar. And yet, beneath the ache lies a secret paradox. The wound that made you hyper-aware also presses you toward the unconscious, into that vast underworld where archetypes breathe and shadows roam. What the daylight world called fragility, the deeper world names initiation. In myth, darkness has always been the womb and the tomb, the place of endings that conceal beginnings. To descend into it is not punishment, but passage. The empath cannot avoid this descent. By nature, they are drawn to the sorrows of others as if to their own reflection. The descent is not chosen but compelled, a gravitational pull into shadow and despair. But here, within the labyrinth, another possibility is seeded. For when you walk through the abyss, the psyche offers symbols, images that reveal both terror and transformation. Consider the dream image that so often haunts: a forest at midnight, wolves at your heels, breath running short. The first response is terror. What hunts you will surely devour you. But then the image shifts. The wolves encircle, not to kill, but to accompany, to synchronize their breathing with yours. What seemed an ending becomes an initiation. The dream insists that what you fear as destruction may be the very energy that teaches you how to survive among primal forces without being shattered by them. This is the paradox I ask you to hold. The empath is forged not by gentle love, but by the furnace of wound. Sensitivity is not a luxury of temperament, but the result of psychic necessity. And still, it is not only survival. For those who endure the wolves long enough, discover that the forest itself contains a secret gift, an inner eye that can see beneath appearances, a capacity to read archetypes shimmering behind ordinary pain. If you are listening now, pause and notice your own journey. Where did your sensitivity begin? Which wound carved its way into you so deeply that you can never quite close? That scar is not only injury, it is also an initiation mark. The very thing you have tried to hide from the world may be the sign that you were chosen to walk a path of deeper sight. And as you reflect, I invite you to join this journey fully. Leave a comment sharing where in the world and at what hour you are listening right now. Know that you are not alone. Others who carry these wounds walk beside you in this community. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the stories we uncover together here on Carl Jung Stories Unveiled. The Empath's opening chapter, then, is not simply about suffering. It is about recognition. Recognition that the wound is not random, that the wolves are not only predators, that the darkness is not only annihilation. Each carries a secret role, to draw you into contact with the unconscious, to open the possibility of vision. The paradox is that what feels like your greatest curse is already carrying the seed of your greatest gift. Hold this paradox as we move forward. For in the next stage, The descent does not stop at fear. It opens further into initiation, into the archetype of the wounded healer, where the empath must learn to walk a razor's edge between rescuing others and healing oneself, between bleeding out and transmuting pain into wisdom. The path deepens, and what once seemed like mere endurance begins to reveal its initiatory nature. To be an empath is not simply to suffer. It is to be drafted into mysteries larger than your biography. Darkness itself becomes the teacher, the crucible where illusions are burned away, where the ego, fragile in its defenses, collapses under the weight of feeling. What emerges from that collapse is not only sensitivity, but vision. The inner eye is born, an eye that perceives meaning within chaos, symbols shimmering behind pain, archetypes moving beneath ordinary events. Yet here the danger is sharp. Many confuse the wound with their identity. They believe compassion means carrying endless burdens, being perpetually drained, living as the sacrificial lamb upon the altar of relationship. But that distortion is not the gift. The gift arrives only when the empath confronts their own shadow, when they recognize that the impulse to rescue may be a disguised avoidance of their own inner work. This razor's edge is ancient. In myth, we find it in Chiron, the wounded healer. In shamanic traditions, we see the one struck by illness who, through surviving, acquires the power to heal. The wound is not bypassed. It is endured and then transformed into medicine. The empath stands in this lineage, but like Chiron, the danger is clear. The healer who does not tend their own wound is consumed by it, endlessly projecting it outward, endlessly trying to repair in others what they have neglected within. The figures that populate the unconscious now step forward. The rejected child, still weeping in the dark. The abandoned lover, carrying grief like a stone. The tyrant parent, booming commands from within. The devouring shadow, always hungry. These are not only memories, they are archetypal roles in the theater of psyche, demanding recognition, not repression. The empath cannot skip past them. They must be faced, named, and integrated. For only through this encounter does alchemy take place. In the heat of this confrontation, something shifts. Compassion ceases to bleed endlessly. It begins to shine. Sensitivity becomes discernment. You start to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to another. This is not cold detachment, but clarity. At first, the empath drowned in every tide of emotion, unable to distinguish their own sorrow from the sorrow they carried. But after initiation, a faculty awakens. You know what is yours and what is not. You begin to perceive not only the pain, but the archetype beneath it. The mother wound, the father complex, the anima searching for the animus, the shadow pressing for recognition. And here, the empath begins to take on the mantle of the seer. Compassion is no longer naive pity. It becomes a knowing gaze that pierces through surfaces. When another weeps, you sense not just their personal grief, but the ocean of collective sorrow that runs beneath it. You become a mirror where unconscious patterns reveal themselves. This is both the glory and the burden of the empath. But wisdom alone is never enough. The gift is always double-edged. To see deeply carries responsibility. Once you can glimpse the inner currents of another, you must resist the temptation to manipulate, to control, to become savior. True empathy does not enslave. It does not exploit vulnerability. Instead, it holds presence with reverence, allowing each soul to walk its own labyrinth without coercion. The empath's initiation teaches humility. Love is not possession, but presence. And so the image of the phoenix arises. Burned down to ashes, it rises again radiant. The empath, too, consumed by their darkness, emerges with new wings of fire. The ashes of despair become soil for wisdom. This is individuation in Jung's terms, the weaving of shadow and light, pain and joy into wholeness. Not perfection, not escape, but integration. Pause here and reflect. Where in your own life have you carried another's burden so deeply you almost disappeared? Can you feel how that instinct, though noble, may also mask your avoidance of your own work? This is the turning point. To realize that empathy is not martyrdom, but initiation. To claim the wound not as prison, but as doorway. As we step forward, the narrative broadens. For individuation is not only a private alchemy, it carries collective weight. The empath, having faced shadow and flame, begins to realize they are not merely personal sufferers. They are vessels through which the collective unconscious speaks. This shift marks the next stage. Sensitivity refined into discernment, presence turned into vision, and the empath recognized not as victim, but as seer. From this point, the journey bends toward transformation. Sensitivity that once drowned now learns to breathe. The empath discovers that the tidal waves of emotion no longer carry them helplessly from shore to shore. Instead, they awaken to discernment, a faculty more precious than gold. Discernment means you know the difference between your own sorrow and the sorrow you perceive in another. It is the shift from being consumed to becoming conscious. At first, this is subtle. You catch yourself pausing before absorbing a friend's grief. You notice a boundary within, a line that says, "This belongs to them, not to me." That pause is the birth of sovereignty. It is not coldness, it is clarity. To feel with another is not to collapse into them. To care does not require surrender of self. This distinction is the empath's true inner compass. Vision grows here. You begin to see beneath surfaces. An outburst of anger is no longer only personal. You glimpse the archetype of the wounded child or the unhealed father complex. A repeated pattern in relationships becomes not just irritation, but a mirror of the collective shadow pressing for recognition. The empath becomes more than a sponge of feeling. They become a seer of patterns. And yet, vision is dangerous without humility. Once you see deeply, the temptation arises to manipulate, to assume control, to rescue before being asked. But to do so would corrupt the gift. The true empath, seasoned by darkness, learns the discipline of restraint. They hold their insights not as weapons, but as lanterns. They offer presence without coercion, clarity without demand. They understand that no soul can be forced toward healing. Each must walk its own path, in its own timing. In this humility, compassion transforms. It ceases to be pity, which disempowers, and becomes reverence, which honors. You no longer seek to save. You simply accompany, like a steady flame in the storm. This is why others trust the empath who has endured their own descent. Because you no longer need to prove yourself by fixing anyone. Your gift is presence, not possession. And here, individuation deepens. Jung spoke of individuation as the integration of opposites, shadow and light, instinct and spirit. The empath lives this process intimately. In surviving their own darkness, they become living proof that wholeness is possible. They are no longer fragile victims, but resilient vessels. The very sensitivity once seen as weakness now communicates strength, because it has been tempered by fire. But individuation is not a solitary gain. It radiates outward. Once integrated, the empath realizes they are not only themselves, but also a threshold for the collective unconscious. Their fragility, often misjudged by others, is in fact porosity. the membrane through which the archetypes breathe. This role is not chosen, it is vocation. The empath becomes the vessel, the mirror, the bridge. Such responsibility requires continual humility. The unconscious is a double-edged power. If untempered by love, it slides into manipulation. If seized for ego, it becomes control. The empath who remembers the descent knows better. They carry the memory of their own wolves, their own floods, their own fires. That memory teaches patience. They know that healing cannot be rushed, that wisdom is not spectacle. They resist the urge to dominate, choosing instead to witness, and the dream images shift. Early in the journey, the unconscious overwhelms, floods that drown, waters without end. Later, after integration, the waters remain but change. The dreamer finds themselves in a boat or discovers they can breathe underwater. The waters no longer annihilate, they become navigable. This is the symbol of discernment. Emotions still surge, but you know how to move with them without losing yourself. This is the empath's alchemy. Sensitivity refined into discernment, compassion purified into reverence, presence transformed into vision. The gift is not immunity from pain, but intimacy with it. To sit beside despair without drowning, to listen to rage without becoming it, to cradle grief without being consumed. This is the birth of the inner healer, not the rescuer who extinguishes, but the witness who midwifes transformation. And so the empath becomes a paradox embodied, fragile enough to feel, strong enough to endure, wise enough to hold. The storm may still rage, but you no longer fear it. For within you burns the steady flame of discernment, guiding you through. As we move ahead, the narrative will shift once more. We will step into the language of alchemy and projection, where the empath learns not only to survive the unconscious, but to work with it, to hold it as a vessel, to transmute suffering into wisdom. The path now takes us deeper into the alchemical furnace, where images of fire, water, and vessel reveal the hidden mechanics of transformation. The empath who has endured darkness discovers that survival alone is not enough. The psyche demands something greater: transmutation. This is why alchemy becomes the language of the empath's journey. What the medieval alchemists called nigredo, the blackening, is the phase of despair and collapse. The empath knows it well. The endless night, the drowning flood, the suffocating fire of sorrow. Yet if endured without fleeing, nigredo gives way to albedo, the whitening, the illumination after dissolution. This rhythm of death and rebirth is the empath's heartbeat. Projection, too, must be unmasked. Before the descent, the empath often mistakes their own shadow for another's sorrow. "I feel your pain," they might say, not realizing it is their unresolved grief reflected outward. Darkness strips away this illusion. When you have faced your own wound, you can finally separate what belongs to you from what belongs to another. This discernment marks the threshold into true vision. Without it, empathy collapses into projection, a hall of mirrors that blinds both self and other. With it, empathy becomes wisdom, a mirror that clarifies rather than distorts. Dreams once again offer their images. In the early stages, waters overwhelm, floods without end, the terror of drowning. But after the descent, the waters are transformed. The dreamer finds a boat, learns to breathe underwater, or encounters a guide who teaches them to swim. The unconscious does not vanish, but the relationship to it changes. What once annihilated now becomes navigable. The empath learns not only to endure the tides, but to sail upon them. This is where the vessel appears, the alchemical container. Without a vessel, the volatile substances of transformation would dissipate. The empath, after walking through darkness, becomes such a vessel. They can contain intensity without collapsing, hold paradox without needing premature resolution. They embody what Jung called individuation, the weaving together of opposites into a living wholeness. In their presence, others find healing not because their problems are solved, but because they sense containment, the possibility that suffering need not destroy. The empath's role here is not to extinguish pain, but to witness it, to hold it until it ripens into meaning, to sit beside despair without needing to banish it, to cradle grief until it shifts into wisdom. This is the labor of the inner healer. The gift is not immunity from suffering, but intimacy with it. You become a midwife for the unconscious, accompanying its labor pains as it struggles to give birth to new life. This transformation is quiet, yet radical. In a culture addicted to speed and numbness, the empath embodies patience and feeling. In an age of noise, they listen. In an age of control, they wait. In an age of numbness, they bleed into presence. But to embody these qualities without collapse requires precisely the initiation we have traced, the descent into shadow, the alchemy of integration, the unmasking of projection. And so storms lose their terror. After the descent, when destruction rages again, the empath knows it will not annihilate. Trees may fall, waters may rise, but clarity follows. Just as the air after a storm feels sharper, so too does the empath live with an inner clarity born of having survived. They no longer fear collapse, because they know regeneration is woven into the fabric of psyche. Their life itself becomes testimony to resilience. Reflect here. How do you hold intensity in your own life? Do you flee, numb, collapse, or have you discovered the vessel within that allows you to endure without disintegration? To find that vessel is to claim your alchemy, to become porous without breaking, open without dissolving. As we move to the final stage, we will see how this alchemy culminates not just in personal resilience, but in a collective role. For the empath who has endured now stands as a bearer of hope, a bridge for others, a steward of wholeness. This final passage leads us through death and rebirth, through bitterness faced and transfigured, until we arrive at sovereign wholeness. The final stage arrives like dawn after a long night. The empath who has survived descent, endured the crucible and held the vessel of transformation, now steps into a new life. Storms still come, but they no longer dominate. Sensitivity remains, but it is tempered by discernment. The empath no longer mistakes their suffering for their entire identity. Instead, they embody the paradox of being fragile and strong, porous and sovereign, wounded and healed. This is the moment when hidden bitterness surfaces. Beneath years of giving, beneath the posture of saintly sacrifice, resentment has often grown. Resentment that no one sees, that corrodes compassion from within. If ignored, it poisons the gift, twisting empathy into control. But the descent into darkness forces confrontation. You confess your shadow. You are not only selfless but selfish, not only tender but angry. You are human. In this confession lies liberation. Your empathy ceases to be a mask of virtue and becomes the radiance of authenticity. Death and rebirth follow. As the gospel image reminds us, unless the seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears fruit. The old empath self, built on wound and survival, must die in darkness. The rebirth is painful. It feels like annihilation. Yet what emerges is not destruction, but transformation. The empath rises not as victim of sensitivity, but as steward of it, no longer enslaved by emotions, but interpreting them, weaving them into meaning. This rebirth is quiet sovereignty. You know sorrow will return, but you do not curse it. You know grief will knock again, but you do not drown. You recognize that life is woven of opposites, joy and grief, love and loss, creation and destruction. To resist is bondage, to embrace is freedom. This embrace is wholeness, the integration Jung named individuation. The empath who has reached this point becomes a living testament. They are not detached from humanity, but more human than ever, capable of tears, of rage, of joy, but each emotion transfigured by deeper meaning. They sense their personal story as thread in a vast tapestry, their wounds linked to the collective fabric of humanity. They become porous not by accident, but by vocation. Through them, the collective unconscious breathes, archetypes reveal, and healing ripples outward. And now we reach the cascade of reversals. Wolves once feared now lie down as companions. Floods once drowning now become seas you can sail. Fires once consuming now become the light that guides. Each threat returns as teacher, each terror reborn as gift. This is the rhythm of initiation. What first breaks you becomes what crowns you. Do not despise your sensitivity. It is not weakness, but raw material of wisdom. Do not curse the nights of despair. They were shaping you into a vessel. Do not believe the lie that empathy is only curse. For once you have walked the underworld, it is also your crown. These triads of blessing reframe what you once feared into what you now carry with reverence. The empath who stands here is no longer merely a sufferer, but a bridge. They are the threshold through which the unconscious speaks, the vessel that holds paradox, the presence that communicates possibility. Their wholeness is not perfection, but integration, not escape, but embrace. They carry an authority born of lived descent, an authority that does not dominate but steadies. Pause for a moment. Imagine your own storms, the betrayals, the abandonments, the nights you thought you would not endure. See how they did not destroy you, but carved you, hollowed you, shaped you into a vessel. This is the secret gift. Not immunity, but intimacy with life in all its contradictions. And as we close, know this. Your task is not to avoid darkness, nor to romanticize it, but to walk through it until you discover the gift hidden there. To live as witness that despair can become soil, that shadow can become light, that wounds can become wisdom. This is the empath's wholeness, the crown won in the underworld, the mystery of being fully alive. The journey we have traced is not merely narrative, it is invitation. To be an empath is to live on the threshold of paradox, where wound becomes wisdom and shadow becomes teacher. For too long, sensitivity has been misnamed as fragility, as curse. But when you endure the descent, you discover it as vocation. You are not broken for nothing. You are shaped for meaning. The cascade of reversals carries its own authority. Wolves become allies. Floods become seas. Fires become light. Each image echoes the beginning, yet returns transformed. Proof that initiation has been completed. The empath who once fled shadow now stands within it as witness, carrying a quiet flame. The blessing triad remains. Do not fear your sensitivity. Do not despise your nights of despair. Do not believe your empathy is curse. Each line lands as benediction, a reminder that wholeness comes not by escape, but by embrace. This closing expands identity beyond gift. The empath is not only one who has survived. They are a vessel of collective wisdom, a mirror through which archetypes reveal themselves. Their task is not to manipulate nor to rescue, but to hold presence. In that presence, others sense the possibility of transformation, not because the empath fixes them, but because they embody hope. And so the final image, after the storm, silence, the air clear, the ground renewed. This is the empath's life post-descent. They do not fear storms. They know clarity follows. They carry not naive optimism, but grounded resilience. If you are listening now, reflect. What storms have you survived? What scars still ache, yet also guide? These scars are not signs of defeat, but of initiation. They mark you as one who has endured, one who has returned with vision. The empath's crown is not glittering gold, but the serenity of wholeness. Not perfection, but authenticity. Not escape, but embrace. To live this way is to be fully human, tender and fierce, broken and healed, luminous and shadowed. And this is the invitation I leave with you. Hold your sensitivity as sacred. Honor the wounds that made you. Trust the darkness as teacher. And walk forward knowing that your secret gift is not only for you, but for the world that waits for your light.